Hello ladies and gentlemen, as you may well be aware, a couple of weeks ago Blizzard announced Wrath of the Lich King Classic. As you might guess, if you've come to some of my streams or seen the first videos I created on this channel, I am exceptionally excited for this. But of course, this announcement stream came alongside a ton of information about how they're going to be running the game, including the 70 boost, no restrictions on creating a Death Knight, and a pre-patch where you can level them. I'll look at the changes to dual specialization and level boosting. And of course, the topic of today's video, the exclusion of the Dungeon Finder tool, or LFG as it's more commonly known. While the 70 boost and the Death Knights were widely considered inevitable, I feel that most people were caught off guard by this specific change, both because we knew that would be on patch 3.3.5 and the Dungeon Finder released in 3.3, as well as most Wrath private servers having this feature in by default, which has been likely the most popular type of private server, or at least equivalent to straight up vanilla. So today I want to look at both sides of the argument and try to see if there's any way to make the majority of people happy going one way or another. Before we begin, there will be a lot more mini essays on gaming and especially MMOs coming, so if you enjoy this kind of content, please like and subscribe below. With the shilling out of the way, let's begin in Blizzard's camp with why they're excluding Dungeon Finder. And really, there's only one reason: the impact it has on the social fabric of the game. As many of you know, the original Dungeon Finder tool was cross-realm, so it was entirely possible to end up in a group with 4 other people from entirely different servers. This was also before sharding and a lot of other server changes made in later iterations of WoW, so the only time you got to interact with these kinds of people were either through LFG or PvP battlegrounds. This kind of disincentivized much social contact beyond basic pleasantries, which even then have stopped being a thing if you look at retail most of the time. This, on top of just teleporting straight to the entrance of the dungeon, taking away the traveling there or organizing summons, really started to make LFG more of a job or something you just do rather than an adventure with your fellow players. All in all, this is a pretty reasonable take from Blizzard, and while I point to sharding and looking for raid as the biggest killers of the social aspect of World of Warcraft, or at least the death of server communities, still you really can't start to see that culture and attitude of convenience over everything develop with the inclusion of LFG in Wrath. Onto the other side of the argument though, there is a far larger range of reasons why people want the inclusion of LFG. The first one is just the convenience. Being able to find groups easily and without the hassle of having to either create one or whisper people, which is a bit of a pain sometimes. This also kind of flows into another thing I've seen people bring up, is that you can play less meta classes or specs and get into groups far easier. As an arms warrior in the Burning Crusade, I can't convey to you how much it sucked to get into groups as more of a utility class than anything else, at least in the first few phases. At best, you get told politely that the group's full or they're looking for a warlock/mage, then at worst, you're just straight up ignored. While in Wrath there isn't as many unviable specs altogether, there is still a meta, and there are still people who are going to have a preference for it, until heroics are eventually just so outgeared it's irrelevant what you bring. Another little gripe a lot of people have is that the random heroic tool especially gave extra emblems of Frost, Triumph, and the really whatever token of the phase was. This provided incentive for people to always be at least queuing and at least interacting with the content, as some players need to feel like they're getting something a little bit extra. For the Burning Crusade example, we can see that a lot more people went back into Karazhan in phase 4 now that all the bosses are dropping badges of justice. The last and an interesting aspect as well to wanting the inclusion of LFG is that it's a way to minimize boosting, both in the way that people no longer have to go into the looking for group channel and get bombarded with a million boosters advertising, but also because it makes boosting less efficient than just dungeon spamming. While it's a similar issue that you're spending all your time in dungeons grinding levels than out in the world adventuring, which does make the world seem a lot more dead, at least you're doing stuff at your own level, as well as not giving money to mages or paladins who have become excessively rich already boosting. As it stands, those are the biggest arguments on both sides that I've personally found. Blizzard wanting to maintain the social fabric, while a lot of the player base want convenience, accessibility, extra rewards, and a reduction in boosters. From here though, just giving you information isn't really helpful to the debate. So let's actually look at the counterpoints and see where some middle ground might be found. To begin with Blizzard again, it seems most people already say that the social fabric they are vaunting is already gone. The server sizes are dramatically larger than they were in the original run of the game, to the point where everyone really does get lost in the crowd. Instead of having a server reputation, you get known in some of the smaller communities in that server. For instance, you might have reputation in certain GDKP discords, among certain guilds or PvP circles, but you really never get a server-wide reputation unless you do something absolutely crazy, like Rickus on Aragal, who is by far the greatest tank ever to exist, and if you haven't seen the video, give it a YouTube. Outside of those fringe cases, however, there really isn't tons and tons of crossover between these subgroups. The only place this argument really stands is in the smaller servers to begin with, although as I would put money on the majority of people being on the larger realms, it's weird to have a universally applied rule just for them. From Blizzard's point of view at the counter arguments, as I can't imagine they didn't do a little bit of research prior to making this announcement, I imagine their counterpoints would be for convenience, that this was the start of a slippery slope, so they're just capping it now to preserve the classic experience in their mind. For accessibility, they're probably looking at Wrath as the peak of the game's balance across classes, and while I said there is a meta, most classes are going to be valuable in some way or another. They can tackle boosting in another way, which they did specify looking at implementing how they did it in Season of Mastery, and then lastly, when it comes to the emblem rewards, the Dungeon Finder came out in patch 3.3, the last patch of the entire expansion. Everything outside of ICC had the old method of grinding in mind, so really those extra rewards would make emblem acquisition way faster than you'd get back in the day. Plus, Phase 1 of Wrath is going to be pretty dull, so actually having to play more to get more emblems isn't a bad thing in their books either. There are issues either side, and in some ways I do want to give Blizzard credit for having some vision of the game that's a bit different to what they originally did. Ultimately, it gives me a bit of hope that they may do things a bit differently if they do a classic Cataclysm, for instance. But of course, it's here at the end I want to look at two ways I think they could approach this that would be satisfying for both sides. The first is lean towards the inclusion crowd, having LFG in the game but limiting the rewards it's providing and having it only be within servers. Queue times may be longer, and that's especially the case for smaller servers, but then you'd actually still get to preserve the server community aspect. In fact, it's entirely possible that because you'll be quasi-forced to deal with people you wouldn't otherwise deal with, more of those server reputations might actually form. You meet people outside of your clique in specific Discord servers, which I think could be additive to the social fabric than subtractive. Alternatively, you could lean more into the exclusion side, and while you don't have an automated LFG, you add in the tool they have for searching for raids and mythics in retail. Makes finding groups dramatically easier and the application process less tedious. You can find groups that you specifically want, and most importantly, allows you to filter out boosters a little bit easier. I've got an ignore list literally full of them, and you still see tons of them in the current looking for group channels. So if you want to go no LFG, you really need to put your foot down on them specifically. Although, what do you guys think? Let me know if there's an argument I missed to either side, or what your solution looks like in the comments below. And now, if you've made it to the end, thank you very much for your time. It is very much appreciated, and I hope you have an excellent day.